Okay, welcome to NMP Symposium. This is our 1 o'clock session with John Conour and Ron Gammill speaking on Lafayette Medallions and Medalets. This presentation will review the types of and known population of oval, gold, and silver Lafayette Medallions, Washington-Lafayette Medalets, and counterstamps of 1824. John and Ron will discuss current misconception as to their history and who did or did not sink the dies. You can, during the presentation, enter questions, and we will cover those at the end. So with that, I will turn it over to John and Ron. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, Len. We got started on this back in February of 2021 when Ron made a phone call wanting to discuss our counterstamps, and he made a comment that there appeared to be a peculiarity in my 1816 in the strike, and kind of from there it's grown into a rather major project. Now, most everybody knows that the medalets and counterstamps were done to commemorate Lafayette's farewell tour in 1824 and 25. Now, we found them to be, fairly scarce. Some of them are quite rare. There's mystery behind really kind of how they all came about, I think, and that sort of thing. And also there's, we feel to be quite a few misconceptions out there. The medalet is just a small round medal. And you can see here that it was struck with a purpose of being used like in important ceremonial type occasions, as many of them had various forms of loop. This has one of the nicer loops with a ring for suspension. The counterstamps were, I think, a little bit more familiar to everybody. I know they were to us when we started, and they appear a lot on large cents, dimes, quarters, and half dollars. Now, medalet really is just a small medal, generally less than 1 inch, and 1 inch is 25.4 millimeters. All the dimensions that you see here that we use will be in millimeters. The Washington-Lafayette medals were slightly over a ½ inch in diameter. Really, I've seen numbers anywhere from 14.3 to 14.8 millimeters. As we said, they were worn to honor Lafayette. And the dies used for the medalets were actually the same dies that were used to make the counterstamps. And we'll show that in some detail later. Now, we actually came across what we call 5 different types of heads of the medalets. The first is the Washington-Lafayette. We found 19 of those, plus we found 2 uniface examples of Lafayette, 1 uniface Washington, and then there was one we call the Star medal. Another type was a somewhat similar design with Lafayette and Washington. It was roughly the same size, has an 1824 date on it. It wasn't listed in some of the references that we had, and we only found 2 of those. The other type is a small, even smaller medalet. It was 8.6 millimeters in diameter, and it was made from tinned white metal, and it also had suspension loops on it. I suppose you wear around your neck, even your wrist, as small as it was. And it was listed as an unknown die sinker, and we found 3 of those. This is the Washington Star medal. You can see that it has a suspension loop as well. We found it in a heritage auction from November of 2009, where it sold for $717. We would expect it to sell for multiples of that number today. And to date, I've only seen 1 of these. And the last major type is what's been called the par nobile fratrum medal. It's much larger than the medalet. It's almost twice the size at 27 millimeters. It was done in 3 different metals: copper, silver, and white metal. And the inscription on the back translates to a pair of noble brothers. Now, we feel it was made in the 1829, 1834 range. Now, coincidentally, Washington's 100th anniversary of his birth was in 1832. Now, it could well have been that it was done to commemorate that. Also, Lafayette died about that in 1834. Now, we're going to look at a couple other medalets here just to give you an idea, the one here on the left was from the Ford sale, and we included it because it was similar to the Lafayette button, the right design, and that's going to come into play when we discuss who made those things. And Wright signed this one. It's on the truncation of the neck. You can blow that picture up and find it. It's really not all that easy to see. The other one that we found was a General Lafayette oval medallion that was gilded, and on one side and silver. It was gilded silver with silver on the other side, and it was listed as an unknown engraver. We're going to have a whole lot more to say about this medallion as we go along. And one we just put in here is kind of an interesting piece, were some cast copies by a gentleman named William Blanding. Dr. Blanding was a medical doctor turned naturalist, and was probably most famous because he had a turtle named after him. And that turtle appeared on the 2021 Canadian dollar. Now, this is a summary of the different types of medalets. You can see there was 25 of the Washington-Lafayette kind. The one we want to pay particular attention to down here is the oval medallions. We found 5 of those. 2 of them were damascene silver, and the other one was just silver. The counter stamps themselves, there were 2 major types. The first type was Washington on the obverse with Lafayette on the reverse. We found 34 of those. They also appeared with Lafayette on the obverse and Washington on the reverse. Found 6 of those. And here again, they appeared on different types of coins. And we feel that this orientation was basically by chance. The number of with Washington or Lafayette on the obverse is around 15% of the total. So it happened fairly often. The third type were coins that were counter stamped only with Lafayette on the obverse. There were 4 different head styles that we saw there. The numbers 1, 2, and 3 we feel were probably trial pieces. 1 and 3 were in literature were attributed to Wright. 2 we couldn't. It was unattributed. And number 4 appears on a large cents dated 1833, 34, and 36, and we'll say a little bit more about that one specifically later as well. The next type is a counter stamp that was made from the Choice of People medal. The Choice of People medal had Lafayette on the obverse and Louis Philippe on the reverse. Now we only found 1 of these, and if you take the Choice of People medal and overlay it on the large cent, it overlays quite nicely. So, and that's why it's a little bit bigger than the large cent. So it shows out right to the edge of the coin. Now, the last one that has been mentioned is a Washington only on the obverse. And we frankly have not pursued that one very close. I suppose you might even argue that it's Lafayette, not Washington. I don't know. But we saw it on 2 dimes and a Chilean real. Now, the Lafayette, we call it the death commemorative medal and counter stamp. So we said Lafayette died. He died on May 20th, 1834. Now you can see this counter stamp here on the 1834 example. The Lafayette portrait is extremely similar to the Lafayette on the Par Nobile Fratrum medal, and it doesn't overlay. And but we feel that shows at least that Wright and Bale did counter stamp coins, which we think is important as we go down the road. Now here we have a summary of all the different counter stamps. We won't go through that in huge detail, but just point out there was no 1821 large cent counter stamp. That was a very low mintage year. There was no 1824. It's likely due to the fact that the 1824 large cents didn't come out to the very end of the year. There were 9 $half, and several different types. We've cataloged those, and we included the reference numbers. And here's another. You can do these statistics a lot of different ways, but what I wanted to point out here is the large cents was anywhere from around 60% to 65%, depending on how you want to count them. Silver was 25%, and foreign coins were less than 10%. Now, when we started doing this, we ran into some strike anomalies. And curiously, these weren't mentioned in the auctions, and don't really know why. So the first one here we'll look at, the one on the left here is a typical full strike Washington head. The one on the right is from my 1816 counter stamp that started this whole thing off when Ron asked, what's that funny stuff on the top of the head? And it's just the fact that it's not impressed enough to remove the lettering on the headband of the matron head. And you also got to watch how these things are oriented, because the next one, it looks like Washington's bald headed. But in fact, what it is due to the orientation of Washington to the matron head, the bald spot is actually in the field of the matron head. And the two lines you see here are lower curls, and the knob that you see here is actually the earlobe for the matron head. And there's some other different styles. We originally called them imprints. And you can see on this coin here, you got the lettering, plus you also have the outline of the matron head itself showing on the under part of the counter stamp. And also a reasonably frequent imprint or incomplete strike we saw was with Lafayette on the reverse, with various parts of the words one and cent. Sometimes you just saw one or two letters, but it was a relatively common striking issue too. Now here we put together a collage of of not all of them, but many of the different counter stamps, and it gives you an idea of the differences in grading and orientation, off center. And up here in the right hand corner, these three right here show the off center. It's quite a bit here. It goes from the up toward the top down. It's starting to approach the bottom. You can see that the orientation of Washington and the matron head is about 45 degrees out, whereas on the piece right below, it's like 180 degrees out. And you see a lot of variation in this. Condition, obviously, is all over the place. This coin right here, it's very worn. It's also appears to be double struck. There's down here in the far right is a very high grade 50-cent piece, very expensive coin. And if you can't see it real good here, but if you see these lines on top of Washington head, that's actually an incomplete strike, and that's the shield on the eagle on the reverse. And also there's several different whole coins that show that this here again was probably used for suspension, just like the Medalets. And in fact, this coin down here has a loop attached. So there's a very interesting set of pictures here. It kind of shows you the gamut of what we saw when we went through here. Now, in rarity and production, we looked at it from the Sheldon standpoint. The Washington-Lafayette Medalets, we found 23 of those, which is an R6. The counter stamps are 40, which is 5+, which is, I don't consider really that rare, but it is scarce. And I think part of the reason that they seem rarer than they are is these coins tend to be hung on by their owners. And the Lafayette, the crude heads that we saw earlier, there's only 3 of those. And the oval medallions at 5s and R7+, which certainly is a rare coin. So the obvious question is, how many were made? Well, it's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to get a really good answer on that, because there are no production records that we know of. The only information we have to go by is by an ad from Thomas Anders in Philadelphia, stating that upwards of 2,000 were produced in 10 days in New York City. And this is where we got to really start to watch what they're referring to, because he was referring to Lafayette oval medallions in gold and silver. And we do not feel that it was a Washington-Lafayette Medalets. And we know however many they're made, there were some left over, because in March and April of 1825, there were ads in the Charleston and New Orleans newspapers that indicated these medals in gold and silver were available for sale. Interestingly, no such information on advertising exists as far as we know it for the Medalets and the counter stamps. We also think trying to determine how many were made is, because you can back calculate on some of the large cents if you want to, is that the survival mechanics were probably different than circulating coins, particularly for the medallions, which we feel probably were regarded as jewelry and may not have been as apt to have been saved as, say, a coin. Now, the connection between the Medalets and the counter stamps, we basically used overlays to make that determination. And here you can see a Medalet overlaid on a counter stamp, and they fit very, very nicely. We actually went through and did all the Medalets one against the other to make sure that the same dies were used throughout. Now, in addition to the overlays, we noticed that the lettering had quite a bit of variation in it that we didn't think was due entirely to wear. So we decided to do a comparison of each letter, and we used a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the most complete. And what we found when we averaged those numbers up is that for the various words and letters, that the shapes of these curves for the medalet here on the top and the counterstamp on the bottom had the same general shape. The numbers didn't match precisely, but the shapes of the curves were very, very similar. So our conclusion from that was the technique that was used to make the medalets was the same that was used to make the counterstamps. And we believe that that was done with a hinged die process. And reason we believe that, it's one of the traits of the hinged die is that you can get good alignment of the dies, but the planchet is prone to not be repeatable. And if you think back about what you saw in off center on the counterstamps, they kind of wandered around a little bit on the large cent base coin. Now we actually did go and use concentric circles and measure the movement of the counterstamp on the large cents, and it was well over twice the amount of movement of Washington's head on the medalets, which we used quadrilaterals and found the centers to see how much they moved. Now the big question is, who made the Lafayette dies, Washington-Lafayette dies? For 145 years, it was credited to Charles Cushing Wright. However, in 1999 through 2008, John Kleberg wrote a series of papers emphatically stating that Wright was not the die sinker, but it was actually one Joseph L. Lewis. And we also noted by 2008, it appeared that the numismatic community had agreed with that attribution. So we started to ask ourselves, what information was used to overturn what was really viewed as standard history, so to speak. Now, Kleberg's conclusions were based on the number of newspaper advertisements in New York and Philadelphia that Lewis took out. He also stated that the lettering was different on the Erie Canal medal, which Wright was the die sinker, and it wasn't the same as on the medalet. He also came down on the fact that the Lafayette portrait for the button was different than the medalet, and that the fact that there was no signature by Wright suggested he didn't do it because Wright signed a lot of his stuff. In fact, he did. Now, when we started looking at this a little closer, we think that basing the conclusion of the maker of a product using newspaper ads is akin to saying your local car dealer manufactures Ford and Chevrolets. The reference to the lettering on the Erie Canal medal is at best enigmatic, and the fact that everyone knows that Richard Trested did the lettering on the Erie Canal medal. This is well documented in the Erie Canal Memoirs of Colden. We also know that Wright was the engraver of the buttons, and more importantly, we're not quite sure why it even applies in this case. Then, as far as the signature goes, we don't think you can argue both ways. Lewis's signature isn't there either, so I don't think you can use that as justification that it wasn't done by Wright or was done by Lewis. So the big Kleberg problem, at least as we see it, is we could not find any examples anywhere of metal work done by one Joseph L. Lewis. The only references we could find to metals and Lewis was ads placed by him or others offering them for sale. The only actual reference we found was in an article, and that was attributed to Joseph Lewis, but it turned out to be Joseph O. Lewis. Now, the point here, other point we want to make is his success as a businessman is not in question. We also compiled a listing of works done by Wright, Lovett, Stout, and Richard Trested. You can see it's in stark comparison to the lack of work done by Lewis. So our conclusion is no way was Joseph Lewis the die sinker. Now, if you accept the fact he was, the New York ads themselves didn't mention Washington. They mentioned metals being in gold and silver, and we know the medalets were silver, although there's vague references to there was a gold one. We've not been able to find it. And in some of those New York ads, there was very meticulous documentation of the words General Lafayette around the silver medal and the gold and the silver medal. So it's pretty well documented that the gold medallion was what was being advertised in those newspapers. The only ad for Washington-Lafayette was Ash and Mason, Philadelphia. We believe that to be inaccurate due to the fact that they claimed it was gold and silver and that sort of thing. But also, interestingly enough, Ash and Mason's next door to Anner's, who was selling the medallions. However, there is an oval medallion that fits the gold and silver description, and that's the one that we saw earlier. Therefore, we do not believe that the ads in the New York papers had any reference at all to the Washington-Lafayette Medalets. So at this point, we got a conundrum. We got the wrong designer, and we have medallions that really weren't described correctly. So how are we going to untangle this mess? We decided to look at additional facts and circumstances. In 1824, what was involved in producing and marketing a product. Now that's important because the same type of thing flows through for when they did like the Erie Canal Medal. There was multiple people involved. Now the circumstances of the time. Who were the men involved in engraving and die sinking? What were their skills? Now the one thing we came to realize fairly early on is that all die sinkers were engravers, but not all engravers were die sinkers. In 1824, there was a confluence of opportunity, with Lafayette's trip obviously being the catalyst. There was a population corridor along the East Coast. The tour itself was well laid out and advertised, so there was always something going on with it. And the other thing that we noticed when we got to look at this, New York contained what we called a circle of talent. Now, we want to show here Lafayette's depiction of Lafayette's tour. He covered all the states, and as we mentioned, it took well over a year. We also went out and looked at a map and circled where Lafayette went his first couple of 3 months he was here, and you can see that from Philadelphia up to Boston, that included the largest cities in the country and essentially a quarter of the population of the country. So there was a tremendous resource for selling anything. Now, we also did look at Joseph Lewis very carefully. Now, he was very difficult to find information about. In fact, in Ancestry, I think he was only in there twice. Now, he was listed as an engraver in one of them. Now, he was known as the millionaire of Hoboken. He died in 1877 and left his estate of a little under $1.5 million to the government to help pay the national debt. He had no heirs. And what we do know about it was actually launched about a 3-year battle on who would get his money. Finally, I think around 900,000 or so went to the government. Now, he had a store at number 3 Wall Street beginning in 1819 through at least 1831, according to the New York City Directory. He was also in the directory at different locations from 1812 to 1841. But interesting enough, in the June 30th New York City Directory, he took it out an ad. And it was the only time he ever took out that ad. So we think that was done for a special purpose. And in fact, in his ad, he talks about how well connected he is, how he has his high-class clientele, the fact that he is an engraver, although when you read his ad, he's really making utilitarian objects. So he was obviously a successful person. He seized, we think, on the opportunity to make a profit. He had readily available pool of people to draw on to design and make the medallions. And he also had storefronts for these people and obviously customers. So he had the expertise and ability and wherewithal to do it. Now we're going to take a look at who we think made the dies. And we want to make a bit of a distinction here is that while the distribution is totally separate of these items, the design and production of the medallions, the medalets, and the counterstamps, we feel are inexorably linked together. Now in New York, there were several engravers of considerable talent, and we talked about the 100 acres. There was in an area of a little over 100 acres, small farm. They all likely knew each other, I would think, or at least knew of each other. And these people included C.C. Wright, Richard Trested, James Bale, who was Trested's apprentice, Asher B. Durand, Cyrus Durand, although not an engraver, he was a bit of a mechanical wizard and was in partnership with Wright and Durand in 1824 and 25. and a little bit longer. And then you had James Stout, Robert Lovett, and then also Peter Maverick, a one-time partner of Durand. On the retail side, there was quite a bit of advertisement stuff, obviously from Lewis, but a clothier named James A. Canfield did a lot of advertising as well. And he was linked to Scoville, the button manufacturing company out of Waterbury, Connecticut. And he also was linked with work between Treston and Wright, and also Durand. Now here's a map of New York City streets from today's, and with locations of these businesses. You can see it's a very small concentrated area. Now the credentials, C.C. Wright, he was a self-taught engraver. He was well established by even in as early as 1820. We mentioned him being a partner of the Durand brothers, and they were primarily making banknotes at the time. He was accredited with 45, 50 different metals. He designed the $50 Humber obverse, which was contracted by the Mint. He was a founding member of the National Academy of Design, and an extremely important point is he collaborated with Richard Treston on several occasions, one being the Erie Canal medal, the Henry Clay token, the DeWitt Clinton medal. And interestingly enough, when Treston passed away, we'll get to that in a minute, Wright and Bale bought his equipment. So that collaboration we feel is very important. Now, Asher B. Durand, he apprenticed to Peter Maverick in, I think it was around 1812 or so. And his first major engraving was John Trumbull's painting the Declaration of Independence. That time, they was basically making his living doing banknote engravings. Now, also Canfield in the advertisements around the time of Lafayette's visit made the statement that he was selling ribbons that were designed and engraved, that the engravings came from Asher B. Durand. And probably the most interesting thing about it, Asher B. Durand, is in 1835, he abandoned engraving to take up painting and became a very famous landscape painter. His large landscape paintings today go for upwards of $250,000 or more. Richard Treston, he came from England in 1819, and he brought Bale with him. He was a noted die sinker. He produced the Castle Garden token. He did work for Scoville. He was a far more important figure than people realize. We believe that's due to the fact that he died prematurely from a finger infection at the age of only 37. Okay, Stout was mentioned in the ads. He was an engraver and map maker. He was more into the utilitarian objects, but obviously did them well, as some of his spoons are in the Metropolitan Museum. And he was well known in New York City. He was in the directory for over a quarter of a century. Robert Lovett, we all know, is a prolific metal designer, although he really got his start in seals and family emblems. And he started in Philadelphia with Thomas Brown. And he moved to New York City in April of 1824. Now, we think the fact that he's there in 1824 doesn't preclude him from selling metal medallions, but we don't really think he probably would have been into the whole route of being consulted to make them, being the fact that he was there, got there fairly recently. Now, Bale, as we mentioned, came to America with Treston, studied under Wright also, and he became a partner of Wright in 1829 and lasted through 1833. And he struck many medals and store cards. Peter Maverick, we mentioned him because Durand was apprenticed to him. He did do engraving work. He became one of the leading lithographers in the country. He's not been associated with medalets or counterstamps. And I think the most important or interesting thing about him is he fathered 17 kids. Now, given the contradictory conclusions that we've seen and what we feel is a misanalysis of the ads, we decided to go back and review as much detailed information as we could. At the top of our list is what did Wright's contemporaries and subsequent numismatists up through around the year 2000 have to say about who made them. And this is just a partial listing of the various auctions and stuff, and it has the auction companies and the consigners, that sort of thing, a who's who of numismatists, if you will, and many times Wright was attributed with the sinking of those dies. Now, we also went a little further. In fact, we wanted to look at how these people's lives stacked up to Wright. So we put we put together time lifelines for these guys. We used Isaac Wood, McCoy, Chapman, Bushnell, and Woodward. And what you can see is in the period of around 1846 to 54, which is 8 years, these guys' vocational careers overlap. So here again, they surely, as they got around in that New York, Boston, Philadelphia area, they probably knew of each other. So I think that adds credence to who they said did the work that they were selling. Now we're going to look at the portraits done by Wright and Bale. Now on the left here, you have one of the silver medallions. Now, the portrait of Lafayette on the other side is not the same. They didn't use, obviously going to use same die. It's slightly different. It doesn't line up. And then on the right is one of the Lafayette Medalets. Now, it was mentioned in one of the auction catalogs that the lettering on the medallion and the medallion and the medalet were very, very similar. So we took and we overlaid them. And once you adjust for curvature and that sort of thing, they do line up extremely well. And we think this points to similarity of, if not the same person doing the lettering, at least it could well have come from the same shop. It also must be remembered that Trested was very, very well known for his lettering. He was not noted so much for portraits. In fact, he was only accredited with one portrait that we know of, and that was Simon Bolivar. We also feel that Bale could well have done the medallion because it's less sophisticated than the portrait of Lafayette on the medalet on the right. Now, when we look at Washington on the medalet, we then went and dug up medals that were attributed to C.C. Wright. The one on the top left here was by Snowden. The middle one is the National Academy exhibit medal. And what we did there is we took this medal and brought down the size to match the medalet, and the facial features are almost an exact match for the Washington-Lafayette medalet. Now, the hair doesn't match, but we'll talk about that in just a second. And some of these others have very similar appearances to the medalet. Now, we also took the Par Nobile Fratrum medal. We reversed the bust, and it's not obviously quite the same, but you'll notice that the hair has been thinned down. And that medal is 27 mil. It's roughly twice the size of the medalet. We figured the hairstyle was changed. Otherwise, it would have overshadowed the rest of the medalet. So our hypotheses are, we believe Bale and Trested did the medallion based on portrait and lettering similarities. Lewis had a distribution network available to him to a location allowed him to tap on the circle of talent, storefronts, that sort of thing, sell the medallions. Wright was possible assistance from Trested and Bale designed and sank the dies for the Washington-Lafayette medalet. Trested also had the facilities for these guys to not only cut the dies, but to produce the medalets and the counterstamps. So our conclusions are that for 145 years, the numismatic community essentially got it right that it was Charles Cushing Wright. After Kleberg's 2008 paper, really the numismatic community essentially bought in. And here again, our conclusion was we could find absolutely no evidence that Joseph Lewis had ever sunk a die in his life. Kleberg misunderstood that the medalets were not the items described in the 1824-25 advertisements. They were in fact the gold and silver medallion of Lafayette, dated 1824. Therefore, based on the aforementioned, we feel that C.C. Wright was indeed the die sinker and could well have been assisted by Bale and Trested, be it lettering or other items such as making them. Now, since we did this paper, a recent Stack's Bowers auction in the description of the Martin coin alluded to the fact that Lewis may well not have been the die sinker. Now, while we came to that conclusion well over a year ago, we did share that information. I'm not sure exactly when it was, Ron, with John Pack, but we feel that the description that was offered in the catalog in many cases, or in several cases, mixed the medallion with the medalet, which when you use that for rationale, we think it's somewhat confusing. He also suggested Gobrecht did it. We went back and reviewed some of Gobrecht's work. I don't really see Gobrecht as being the guy that did this. I think he was busier doing other things. Now, we've submitted supplementary material to the Newman Portal that will support this research. And we're also planning on having a book out. Hopefully, it'll be by about this time next year. I guess we're ready for questions.
Let's jump back in here. First question came up. What's the purpose of counterstamping your own coins?
Do you want to hit that one, Ron? Or?
What is the purpose?
I think there's while Ron's thinking about that, I'm sure he has. We actually have different opinions a little bit amongst ourselves. I think they were made to try to make a buck, or a penny, or whatever you want to call it at that time.
Yeah, also just as advertising.
Yeah, could have been done.
I think Trested had a well-established business. He had a business actually in London before moving to New York City. So, I think, typically counterstamp has been an advertising technique. And certainly in the case of the Washington-Lafayette counterstamp, it was incredibly unique at the time and still is today.
Okay. Next question. In the larger Lafayette medal series, in copper, bronze, and white medal, there's a tiny name, Halliday T in the shoulder curve, and Conour French in the field. Were these two involved in the medals you've discussed? In addition, there are 3 examples of these medals made in flint glass. Are any of the medallions you've discussed known to have been made in glass?
I've not seen the ones of glass.
No, not in glass. I think the 3 medals made of Lafayette, Bell having copied Conour's medal. My own personal feeling is that maybe Wright instructed Bell. I mean, he was his mentor. Bell is not really noted to be that great with portrait work. Maybe Wright suggested to Bell, take that Conour medal, reproduce it. It might improve your skills in portraiture. And that may have led to Bell's contributions to the medallion. But that's just speculation.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. There are some contemporary medals known in glass. The Gobrecht's Franklin medal, I believe, from 1824, was fabricated into at least one glass piece by the Bakewell Sulfide Company. And you see these, if they appear, they tend to show up in, antique glass venues. But so there is some crossover there. Next question, were any medallions and medalets issued in conjunction with the founding of Lafayette College in 1826?
I think they were done by then.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. I mean, I think clearly Snowden in his 1861 book, points to the medalets, as something that was done in celebration of Lafayette's 1824-25 tour. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so it's kind of old news by then.
Now, we do know that there were counterstamps made in the latter part of 1825.
Yes.
And next question, any plans for publication, book forthcoming, or can you announce anything in that regard?
Well, we have a manuscript that's been accepted for the numismatist Unfortunately, it's not scheduled to come out until next year, but like Jack said earlier, we do have plans. We're about halfway through a book, and that hopefully will be out.
And that book will have picture of all the known examples now.
Yeah.
I don't think I mentioned, but we went through all the current archives of the big three now, plus we went through 6,700 auctions on your portal.
Wow. Okay. I'm glad that's getting used.
We didn't do bottoms. They had about that many themselves.
Yeah. All right. Any other questions out there? All right, next one. Very, very interesting. It's obvious you have put in a lot of research time. How long have you been working on this project?
Well, as we stated, we started on this and really in earnest in latter part of February of 2021. And I don't think we're still quite done yet.
Mm-hmm.
Still got a few things we're hashing out.
What was the earliest auction appearance you were able to find of these pieces?
1863,
Yeah.
Is my recollection.
Yeah, that's mine too.
Yeah, 1863. Was that a Woodward auction, Jack?
I think it was. I'd have to go
I think
back.
it was.
See if I can. It might be on this chart
Yeah.
here. If I can go back
Yeah.
and find it.
In 63, the items were not attributed to Wright, but in 64, in the Woodward auction, which was the John F. McCoy auction, was the first time the attribution appeared. We actually go into some
Yeah,
detail.
63. It was a Bangs and Merwin auction.
Oh,
Yeah.
Henry
Oh,
Smith's coin.
yeah.
Supplementary material has quite a bit to say about this. So if you're interested, that would be a good place to go.
Yeah, and sort of the 1860s are sort of this first decade where, you know, the commercial trade within numismatics really starts, you know, ramping up. So, you know, all the things are being described for the first time. So
Exactly.
Now, even when we search the auction records at the portal, there's some of those in the 1840s and 50s. And we didn't find any that we could definitely say were counterstamps, which seems like kind of a long time before it's like 40 years before they showed up.
yeah. Yeah, and of course, very few sales in the 40s, a few in the 50s.
Right.
So. All right, next question. What initially drew you to this series?
I'm sorry, could you repeat?
What initially drew you to the series? What was kind of the attraction here?
I had purchased a Washington-Lafayette counterstamp about 20 years ago from Steve Hayden. And I did so with the idea that it was very interesting, Washington and Lafayette. There had to be some significance to it. And then like Jack said, I knew Jack had an 1816, and in February of 21, I sent him a note, you know, asking him about it. And, you know, we saw the kind of the abnormalities in the top of Washington's head. And, you know, we got interested in the dies, who made the dies. You know, all of a sudden we're looking at part of the vast majority of the literature saying that Wright did this, and then the Kleberg paper came up, and it was, you know, it was kind of that cascade of events.
Mm-hmm.
I think we made the fatal mistake at one point of saying, how many of these damn things are there?
So next question. What's sort of a typical price for these things in the current market? So for example, maybe a more common example on a large cent.
Well, they really cover the whole gamut from a few $100s to like that $1/2, I think went for like 35,000. I think if they start coming out again, they're going to be much stronger prices than in the past, frankly.
I think the last 3 or 4 counterstamp large cents have been in approximately the $3,000 range, but the Martin Medalet, I think, just sold for under 8,000.
And how often are these appearing on the market? How many auction appearances per year might be typical?
Well, not very many, except when Dave Bowers unloaded it.
Oh,
It is interesting that if you look at the auction results, that these things tend to travel in groups.
huh.
Yep.
McCoy had 4.
Mhm.
Mickley had, I'm sorry, McCoy had 3. Mickley had 3. Isaac Wood had 8 or 9.
Huh.
And so they tend to kind of stay together. As you know, you may have an oval medallion, a counterstamp, and a medalette. Also, the uniface, Washington and Lafayette medalettes have shown up, given their rarity, quite a few times.
And how many were in the Bowers collection?
I looked that up once. I think it was in the 10 to 12 range between
Wow.
counterstamps
Wow.
and
Yeah.
medalettes.
Dave
bet
has
it's probably
been
more.
interested in these things since 1955. I mean, goes back a long way. Yeah.
Well, he gets very focused on, a specific thing, and then, moves on to the next thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. All right, if there are any other questions, it's a good time to put them in. We'll remind all the listeners that video will be available in 2 to 3 weeks. And if you just look at the Newman Portal front page, there'll be an announcement there. There'll also be an email to all the event registrants providing details on the video online. So that will come out in due course. And of course, all the video from the past events is also available on Newman Portal. So as always, we do want to thank our sponsors, the Eric P. Newman Numismatic Education Society, for sponsoring this event. And as a reminder, we will be doing a hybrid event next spring with the Central States Numismatic Society, both online and live at Central States in Schaumburg. All right, looks like no other questions, so we'll wrap it up there. John and Ron, thank you very much for presenting today.
Yeah, thank everybody for listening.
Yeah. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Goodbye.